After using the internal add-on to load the PDB file into Blender, we are going to have a look into a different method. And to be honest, this is also my preferred method because I have more control over what my protein is going to look like in the end. Of course, what we need for that is an additional program to prepare the file. So we are going to prepare a coordinate file, and that file is later on loaded on into Blender, and in Blender we are going to take care about the styling. Unfortunately, there is no direct way to load the PDB file into Blender and also do the visualization or the representation change directly in Blender. However, you are going to recognize that this is not really a challenge because you can use the program that you normally use to prepare your visualizations anyway. I'm going to focus on 4 different programs. The technique is always the same, and I'm going to divide all those tutorials into separate sections. So you basically only have to check the tutorial for your program of choice. The first program that we are going to use is going to be Chimera. Chimera is an open source program, and that's also the reason why I would recommend using it, because it guarantees that you have access to it all the time. Furthermore, you can export your file in a quite convenient file type, and I'm going to go into the different file types now. So before we are going to load, I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to let you know what the advantages and disadvantages of those file types are. I've prepared the scene in Chimera already, so that would be my visualization now. So I would like to go for a cartoon visualization, and on the inside of our protein there is the cofactor again, and that one should be in a space filling model. There are a couple of informations that I would like to export into Blender. First of all, that's the information of the coloring of the different atom types. So it would be great if we can preserve that information, because that saves us a lot of time, because otherwise we would have to reassign the colors, which can be quite nasty to do, especially if you have larger molecules on the inside. So for example, if you have a small molecule with only 10 atoms, that's not an issue. But in that case already the flavin is rather large, and it might be quite confusing to assign the colors. So that is my priority in that case. And luckily there is a file type that we can choose that gives us that option. So as soon as you prepared the style of your molecule in Chimera, you go to File, Export Scene, and then you see there is actually a quite long list of different file types that you can choose from. The one that I highly recommend is the first one, which is the Collada file type, and that gives you the option to at least preserve the I'm going to move that to the side, to at least preserve the information of the atoms of the cofactor. Unfortunately, the color that is assigned to the different motifs here, so to the alpha helix and to the beta sheets and the loops, is not saved. However, I think it's more important to have the color code for the atoms anyway. I would, to be honest, not include different colors for different motifs. And that's also the file type that we are going for. Another file type that is normally quite convenient, and we are going to discuss that when we are talking about Yasara as well, is the wavefront object type. Normally when you generate a wavefront object, you get a second file that contains the information about the coloring. For whatever reason, and that's something I cannot answer or solve, from Chimera, the information about the color is not preserved. So that information is lost and it's not saved. Well, there is a file generated, but the file it's not an empty file, but it does not link correctly. Another file type that you can use is STL. STL is normally the file type that is very often used for 3D printing. The advantage of that file type is that every part of your structure here is combined into one file. So that could be an advantage, but also could be a disadvantage. I'm going to open an STL into Blender as well, so that you see the difference. The next file type that would be possible to open in Blender would be the VRML. VRML and X3D are file types that are very similar. So everything that is true for VRML is also true for the X3D file type. The advantage here is that the objects are loaded into Blender as separate parts. So by theory, you could color, for example, the secondary structure motifs differently by reselecting them. However, they are really cut into tiny pieces. And unfortunately, also those two file types do not save the information of color. So to sum that up, I would highly recommend to go with a Collada file, and this is exactly what we are going to do. So we are going to load that, we are going to style the scene, and later on I'm going to just quickly load an object file, an STL file, and an VRL file or a X3D file, so those two files are basically the same, into Blender, just to show you what the difference between those file types are, so that you get a feeling about the features and that you can choose in the future what kind of file type you would like to have. Good, so I exported my scene already in all those file types. So I'm going to move into Blender and I just opened the new scene. So that's basically just a normal startup scene. And here I'm going to activate first of all, my screencast keys so that you can follow along again on the left corner. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the default cube. And now I would like to move my camera a bit. That's something we did not do in the first scene, but something I normally do right at the beginning is I'm going to set it to a different position. And I'm going to shortly explain why I would recommend doing that, especially if you have complex scenes. So if I go into the top view, you see that the camera is positioned between the X and the Y axis, somewhere over there. That is not a problem. You can keep it like this. I find that it's easier to navigate if the camera is aligned on one axis, and I normally go for the Y axis here. So I select my camera and then open the transform tab over there, and then I set every value of location and rotation to 0. That means that the camera is now in the center of my coordinate system facing down. Then I normally just move it along the y-axis, something like -10. So that's something we can adjust later on anyway. And then I just do a simple rotation on the x-axis. So I grab the x-axis, hit R for rotation, and then 90. And now my camera is facing exactly towards the point. The reason I do that is it makes orientation, as I said before, way easier, and also alignment. Of course, that position is style-wise probably not the preferred one, but we are going to find our final position when it comes to the final scene later on. But handling the alignment with a camera like this is way easier than having it somewhere in the middle of the axis. Good. Having done that, I'm going to go into the camera view, and then we are going to load our Collada file right away. That can be done by File, Import, and then there should be quite a long list of different file types that you can load. And the first one that you see is Collada. It might be that the list of your file types is a bit shorter than mine. You can change that by going into Edit Preferences. Then I'm going to enlarge that. Then select the Import Export section, and there you find even more different file types. And you just need to choose the file type that you would like to have. So in case Collada is not activated, activate it here in the Preferences menu, and then go back to File, Import, Collada. And then you have to just navigate to your folder and hit Import. Depending on the size and the complexity of your protein, it might be that the loading takes a couple of seconds. In my case, my protein, I know it's quite, the size is quite decent, so it's not overly large. So it loaded quite quickly. So what the scene looks like now, so I again jumped out of the camera view, is you have the outer part of the protein visible as it is in Chimera and the space filling model of the cofactor on the inside. There are those weird lines. The reason for that is that the cofactor on the inside is linked to an object. Furthermore, there are 3 different new light sources imported that come from Chimera. If we, for example, switch into the rendered mode, first of all, I have to go into cycles again. And then if we switch into the rendered mode, we see that everything is basically black. And this is not how it should be and not how we would like to have it. But we can solve that very easily. So we are going to delete the light sources that come from Collada, from the Collada file. And now we see that those sources are gone. The inside is already colored. So this is what I meant with the color coding of the different atom types. The outside, so if you remember how that looked like, if I go back into Chimera, you see the color code of the helix and the beta sheets, for example, is gone. So everything on the outside is white. There is another thing that is imported that we also don't need, and this is another camera. So you can also delete that one. I'm going to go back into the solid mode because it's easier for you to see. Then those weird lines, as I said before, come from that node here. And if you just delete that, those lines are gone, but something else happens. The orientation of your protein jumps as well. But this is not an issue because we can rearrange it anyway. So I would recommend doing all those commands before you actually start, because it might mess up your scene afterwards. So let's have a look to the structure now. So if I zoom in a bit from the top, what you see is that certain elements of the structure are separated from the rest. So you see that if I click on different parts, it's not like a complete structure of the secondary structure motifs. So it's quite a mix of weird parts. This is very inconvenient to handle, and this is something we are going to change now. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a very fast manner. Of course, you could select all of those things separately, but you see, for example, the caps over there are separated from the rest. So if I, for example, select them and move them, and that can be very nasty to select. So we are going to use a method that makes it as easy as possible for you to select everything and not lose parts of the structure. First of all, we are going to filter or going to add some of the features here by using the funnel icon, and we will need the selectable option, and I'm also going to switch on the render option just in case if we need it. What we don't want to modify, of course, is our camera. So I'm going to lock the camera, and I'm also going to lock the light because we are going to take care of that later on. Now, we would first like to group everything that belongs to the cofactor. And that could be done by just again selecting all of our atoms separately. So you could do that by pressing Shift and just clicking. But you see, this is also something that might take quite long. Another option would be to check, as you see, all those elements are separated objects in our list, but it does not give a name basically. So you cannot see what kind of part of the structure that is. So you could either select everything from the list that belongs to our cofactor, and it seems like that icon over there is an indicator that is a molecule that belongs to the cofactor. However, for example, if I zoom in, you see that the items with the number 0 and 1 are also belonging to the cofactor, and those are, for example, the phosphate molecules, and they don't have that icon over there. So this is not a reliable indication that everything basically with the icon belongs to the cofactor. So I normally resort to a different method, and that's quite convenient. That might be helpful for you in the future as well. So you can just select, for example, one of the oxygen atoms, go to select link, and then I go to material. So that means everything that has the same color as my oxygen atoms are selected. And then I'm going to group them by just hitting Ctrl J. And I'm going to repeat the same thing with the different atom types. So next thing would be nitrogen. Go to select, select linked, material, Command J. The same thing for the carbon atoms. Select, select linked, material, Ctrl J. And last but not least, the two atoms of the phosphate moieties. Select, linked, material, Ctrl J. And then we could of course make a group of all of those atoms by just selecting all of them by hand now, so it's way easier, it's only 4 of them, and perform Ctrl J again, and then everything is grouped into one object and it's way easier to handle. The convenient thing is now that we know everything that is on the outside now of our cofactor can be selected as well if we just lock the cofactor and we hit A for selecting everything, and then we just make sure again that one part of our structure is active, so one needs to be light orange, otherwise the Ctrl J command is not going to work. And then you hit Ctrl J again, and we see that everything is grouped into one object, and that's way easier to handle now. So I'm going to rename those objects so that I know what I'm dealing with. I'm going to call the outer part protein and cofactor for the inner part. And then I can free the cofactor again. And now I'm going to select both of those elements and I'm going to scale it down. Before I do so, there is one last remark that I would like to give you, or one last tip. The center of those elements is now randomly chosen, or rather defined by the active object that you selected before. And you see it somewhere over there. That makes rotation and orientation quite difficult to do. But we can also solve that super easily by just selecting both of the objects, going into Object, Set Origin, and say Origin to Geometry. Then it's going to be switched, so the origin is going to be switched to the center of our object. And now, if we do some modifications, it's way easier to handle and way easier to move. So I'm going to move the object now to the center of our coordinate system, go into the camera view so that it's easier to find the center, and there we are. Good. So let's see how that looks like if we switch into the rendered mode. So now we have our first molecule loaded in a different style into Blender, and now we are going to take care of the styling of the molecule. And here the focus lies on how to style the different atom types, because now that's a bit different as we had it before, but it's actually even easier. So I'm going to go back into the solid mode. And the first thing I'm going to do before I change the color is I'm going to add a plane. So we are going to have the molecule sit on a table. And of course that could be a white plane as we had before, but I would like to have it a bit more stylized now. And I'm going to show you a new way on how to make a quick wooden table, for example. To do that, we are going to load an image into Blender, and I'm going to use an image that comes from Pexels, which is a platform for free images. And if you just type the wood texture, for example, you have a large variety of different wood textures that you can choose from. I'm going to go with that one, but you can, of course, choose whatever structure you would like to have. I already downloaded that one so that I can load it into Blender. You don't need to take care of a specific file type, so a JPEG, a PNG, or whatever the image type is totally fine. Then we need to activate an import option. So we go into Edit Preferences again, and then we type image, And there is an option which is called import images as planes. So just activate that one. And if that's activated, you can leave the menu again. Adding the image is super simple now. You can either use the menu over there, go to add image as plane, or as the shortcut goes, Shift A, you get the same menu. Then you go to image as plane, and then you just look for the place where you saved the image, select it and say import. You don't need to change anything in the import sections, in the import options here. Now the plane is imported into the center of your coordinate system. We are going to do a rotation of 90 degrees, move it down a bit, scale it up, and let's see how that looks like now. Yeah, so there we have a table. I'm going to move it up a bit as well. So there we have something like a table, like a wooden table where our protein sits on. Now I'm going to do a slight change to our camera because I would like to have some kind of top view to that scene. So I'm going to select the camera. You can do that by just clicking in the menu, and I'm only going to use the transform menu over there. That means I don't have to unlock it. And I'm going to move the camera up a bit. So I'm going to enlarge the C value, and then I'm tilting it back again. A bit more. Yeah. And then I'm going to enlarge my table a bit, go into the top view, because then I have more control over that. I think I can turn the camera a bit more even. Yeah, approximately like this. So what I wanted to achieve here is I wanted the wooden batten to cover my complete view of the camera. So you see that everything is filled now with the image. Then I'm going to increase the size of the protein a bit. And I'm also going to find a nice orientation of the protein so that my cofactor is nicely visible. For that, I'm going to go back into the solid mode, because then it's a bit easier to see what's going on there. I think that actually that side of the protein looks quite nice already. Yeah, so that is... There is, you see, nicely into the center of the protein. If you go into the front view and select the plane, you see exactly how far the plane is away from your protein. So I'm going to grab the plane and just move it up so that the protein is really sitting on the plane quite nicely. Then, of course, it might be that you have to rearrange the plane a bit, because now I would have a gap in between here. So I'm just going to move it on the y-axis a bit, so I'm going to move it down so that everything is nicely covered again. Go back into the rendered mode, and now the protein is nicely sitting on the table and there are just tiny points touching the table. Good, so now let's take care of the styling. First of all, we are going to style the cofactor in the middle. So I'm going to zoom in, select the cofactor. And the quite convenient thing now is, since we group the cofactor, we can also change the colors in that complete scene without having to select all the different atoms. So if we go into the material properties, we see that there is a list of all of the 4 colors present in that one object. So we have the warm gray tone for the carbons, so I'm going to rename the objects. Then it's easier to distinguish. Then we have phosphate here. Blue is of course for nitrogen. Oops. and red is for oxygen. And if you would like to change one of the colors now, for example, the oxygen, then just select it here. And that is the very familiar looking menu that we had before. And then of course you can also activate the preview and you can do all the modifications there. So what I'm going to do is I would like to have glossy atoms again. Then I would like to have a more saturated red, and even I would like to have it a bit more pinkish. I'm going to do the same modifications now for all the other colors. So also for the nitrogen, I would like to have a darker blue and glossy as well. For the phosphate, I like the color of the orange or the yellow. I'm just going to make it glossy again. And for the carbon, just to show you that you could also go for a totally different shader, I'm going to actually go for glass with an emission, so that it looks a bit like, so you see it looks a bit like plastic actually with the light emitted. Let's turn up the emission a bit so that it's a bit better visible and a bit lighter. If I zoom out again, you see that would be the style of your cofactor, and if you select it, you can rechange or you can change the settings again by just selecting the different atom types here. Now let's take care of the outer part of the protein. The white actually looks quite nice, but I think there is not really a difference between the cofactor and the outside, so I would like to have it stand out a bit more. I'm going to go with the glossy version of it again, but I'm going to make it really dark. So instead of having a white version of it, I would like to have a really dark gray version. I'm not going to go black completely, but rather just a dark gray. So what you see now is that the cofactor on the inside is emitting light, and we have nice reflections on the gray outside of the protein. If you would like to enhance that reflections, again, a reminder of something we did before already, increase the metallic value and the reflection is going to be more visible. A second styling part that I would like to do on that scene is I would like to change the position of the light. So first of all, again, I'm going to change the point light to a sun. Now, of course, we have to turn down the value of the sun. And I'm also going to make a sharper shadow. I'm going to set that one to 2 approximately. And I would like to have a scene where it looks like that the sun is setting. So it should be very flat in terms of the angle here. So I'm going to go into the top view. Sorry, that was the front view, into the top view to see how the sun is aligned. And now I'm going to do the same thing as I did before with the camera. So I'm going to set the rotation values to 0. So it would be like you have the sun on midday. And I'm also going to set the position to 0. So now you see the sun sits in the center of the coordinate system. I'm just going to move it up a bit so that it's easier to see what we are doing. And then I would like to have a very flat light so that the shadow is very long in this position and the sun should be behind our object. So I'm going to move that as well. So the only rotation I need now is the rotation around the x-axis. And I'm going to do it by clicking here and dragging, and you see that the shadow is basically moving along. And to make it easier, I'm going to go into camera view again, so you can follow the light basically by being in camera view. So that looks already quite nice because we have a reflection on our wooden floor. I'm also going to introduce a bit of rotation in the z-axis so that it's not directly behind our object. Something like this. I would like to have my scene a bit lighter, but I'm not going to increase the amount of the strength. I'm going to go into the world tab and just make the surroundings a bit lighter by just changing the color of the scene here. One thing I'm going to change in the light section though is the temperature of the light. So now you see the color is set to white. I'm going to make it a bit warmer so that it looks a bit more like sunset. Since the color of the sunset is warmer, I'm going to increase that. And then let's play a bit with the, because it gives a nicer shade of the wood as well. You could do all the modification to the wooden plane that you normally do to an object as well. So you see that you have the same menu over there. So the shader that is applied to your image is the principal BSDF shader. So for example, if you would like to have a glossy shining or a glossy shiny surface, you also can decrease the roughness and then you have a glossy shader on top of your image. So what happened now is, you see before we had the reflection of our light on the table, and if we decrease it, basically it's gone and there is a bit of reflection going on here from our emitting cofactor. Also, again, if you would like to increase that reflection, you can also increase the metallic value here, something I'm just going to show you quickly. But in that case, so you see there is a reflection of the cofactor. In that case, I'm not going to do that because it really interferes with our shadow. So we would have to find a different setup so that the shadow is not colliding with our reflection here. So I'm going to turn it down, but just that you know that this is an option as well. I'm going to keep it with the very light reflection here. Perfect. Then I would like to introduce another element to that scene quite quickly, and this is text. So I'm going to select my object here, my protein. I move it to the side and I would like to have the name of the protein written here as well in 3D. So you hit Shift A to introduce a new object, and there you have text, and just select text. Then the text is aligned to the middle of your scene. You can hit Tab, then you enter a mode where you can edit the text, just delete it and write the name of the protein. I'm going to use BBE, short for berberine bridge enzyme, and I'm going to do a rotation of 90 degrees to have the text face me. Then I'm going to go into the top view by hitting 7. I'm going to move the text to the front because I would like to have it sitting next to our protein. By going into the front view with hitting 1 and selecting the plane, I see how far my text is away from the plane, and I'm going to move it down. So I know that approximately that's the power of the molecule that touches the plane. So I'm going to align the text with that one. Let's see if that fits. That actually fits perfectly. Then I go back into the camera view. And here you see that the shadow is a bit away from the text. So we can move it down a couple of units. And then we are going to style the text a bit. As soon as you add text to a scene, you get the new menu now. And here you can also choose the font. Choosing the font in Blender is a bit different and a bit weird. So you open the tab over here and then you need to navigate to the folder where your font is stored. I have one folder lying here, and as soon as I open that, the font is going to change. Something quite convenient if you would like to have your text 3D as well. So if you would like to give it some sort of body, there is the geometry tab over there and an extrude menu. So if you increase the number here, you see that your text gets a bit of body and is nicely integrated into your 3D scene. The last thing I would like to do is I would like to give the text the same texture as my carbon atoms to have it shiny and emitting light. That can be done also quite easily. If you enter the material properties, you don't need to recreate the material, but you can just select it from your list here. And now you see the reason why we named our materials previously, because now they are easier to distinguish. And then you just select carbon, and there you go. So there is the text now. I'm going to move the text a bit to the back so that it's somehow more integrated into my scene, and some parts of it are covered by the protein already, so that you see that the text is really standing next to the protein. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an additional light source that is not really used to light the scene, but rather to create nice reflections. And for that, we are going to use a very simple trick. So we are going to use planes that emit light. I'm going to go back into the solid mode, hit Shift A and go to Mesh and use a simple plane. Then I'm going to go into the top view so that it's easier for us to see what we are doing. And I'm also going to hide our table. So what I would like to create now is something that looks like the reflection of a window. And that can be done by just using that plane. Make a duplication by hitting Shift D, clicking again, and just dragging the plane, in my case, to the right. Then I'm going to select both of my planes, do the same command again, Shift T, click, and move it to the top. And then I'm just going to play with the arrangement, so have nice gaps in between. And to make it easier to handle, I'm also going to join all of those 4 planes by having the command Control J and object set origin to geometry, because then it makes rotation and everything a bit easier. Then we are just going to assign a material. So I'm going to hit new. And in that case, I'm using just a very simple emission shader. So just go for emission, and normally the low emission at the strength of 1 is already enough. So now that selection of plane just needs to somehow hover above our scene, and I'm going to go into top view again. So I'm moving up top view, and then I'm going to do a slight rotation so that it's basically tilted a bit. So this is what it looks like now. And if I go back into the rendered mode, and of course I also need to re-add the plane, what you see now is those tiny reflections in parts of our molecule. And this adds a bit more realism to the scene. Because normally if you have something lying on your table, there must be some windows somewhere that basically light our scene, and that should be a very simple way on how to simulate those tiny details. So to give an idea how it looks without our planes, so if I go back again, that would be with planes, without, with planes. So you see that it actually makes a difference because we get more of those reflections. Before we do our final render, just some tiny details that we need to do to make our scene basically perfect. Whenever you have glass material, especially at the text over there, you see there are some very nasty looking dark spots at certain areas of the text. Solving that is also done very easily. You go into the modifier properties and you select a modifier called edge split, one that we used before. And as soon as you select it, those dark spots are basically gone. Now let's have a look to our cofactor on the inside. And I'm going to switch into the solid mode again. You also see that the spheres that we have here are not overly smooth. So you see that the resolution of those spheres is not very high. That can also be solved by again staying in the modifier tab and selecting the subdivision surface modifier. It might take a couple of seconds to be applied, depending on the size of your molecule on the inside, but now you see it looks way smoother. And the final rendering is going to be even more smooth because the render settings is 2 and the viewport is 1. So if I go to 2, we see what the final render is going to look like, and that looks really smooth now. If you want, of course, you can even set it up to 3, then it's going to be even smoother, but keep in mind that it also might take a bit longer to render. But since our scene is not overly complicated, I think we can go up to 3 and have it displayed nicely. So let's have a final look to our scene. I think that looks actually really nice. I could imagine using that image, for example, as a title slide on a presentation. So there would be a bit of space left here to add the title of your presentation. You could even move the molecule a bit to the front, or even have it, let's try how that looks like, have it sticking out of the scene so that you have more space here to add the title. You could even remove the text if you would like to have it more clean. I'm going to keep it here in the middle now, just for the sake of seeing everything. But I think that this is actually a very balanced and nice scene. So let's give it a try and let's do the final render. The settings of the rendering, I'm going to keep them the same as they are. So the standard settings, also the resolution, I'm going to keep the same. I'm just going to turn on the denoise again because it's going to speed up the rendering process, especially with the reflection and the light emitting materials that we have here. So I would say let's give it a try, and I'm going to be back when the rendering is finished. So see you in a couple of minutes. And this is what the final outcome of my rendering looks like. I am actually quite happy with it. I also like the reflections of the light emitting objects and the dark structure of my protein. I'm going to save that image now. That can be done by saying image, save as, and here you can decide what kind of format you would like to have. So I'm going to go for a JPEG. The color system is fine, and I'm going to give it a name and save. Then you can close that window and we are back to Blender again. As promised before, I'm going to quickly show you now the difference between the other file types so that you know about them, even though I would highly recommend to stick with the Collada. But just to complete the tutorial, you should know about the different file types and the advantages and disadvantages. To make it easier for you to see what I'm doing, I'm going to hide all of the objects except the light and the camera. I'm going to lock those two. The first file type that I would like to load would be the STL file. And this is how that file looks like. So apparently it looks very similar to what we had before, but what you see now is it's one object. So you see here also in our menu, it's only one object showing and everything belongs to that object. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, colors are not saved. So everything has the same color. It would be possible to separate all of those objects, and that's something I can show you quickly. To do so, you go into edit mode and then you hit P and you say separate by loose parts. That might take a couple of seconds depending on how well your computer is equipped. And if you leave the edit mode again using that menu or just hitting tab, you can now select the object separately. Of course, in theory now, you could give all the atoms the colors that they need, but as I mentioned before, that is a very tedious thing to do, especially if you have a larger molecule in the inside of your protein. Another difference that you see is that our objects here, they do not look smooth. This is something you can change quickly, so that's not a problem. You can right click on the object and select shade smooth, and then you would be with the same representation as we had before. So this is not an issue and also not a limitation. Now, of course, it's only applied to that one helix that we have here, but of course, if you have the complete object joined, then of course it would be applied to the complete object. However, as I said before, for me, the huge downside is that the colors of the atom types are not saved. If you only have a representation that only shows the protein, then of course that's not an issue. Then the STL format would be the perfect one for you to go for. If you have something where you need color coding, especially for the atoms, then of course the Collada file type would be the perfect one for you. So I'm going to go back again and I'm going to delete that object. The next one I'm going to load is the wavefront object. And here I said before, in theory, it should be possible to get the object and the material information, which is saved in that file that is also automatically generated. For whatever reason, and I don't know where that comes from, that file type seems to be broken. So you see, even though we have something here, the complete scene is basically empty. So the object or the wavefront object file is empty and there is nothing there. That only happens if you generate it from Chimera. So just keep in mind that that's an issue that comes with Chimera. We are going to use Yasara later on, and the wavefront object from Yasara is actually perfect. And that would be the file type that I would recommend if you have Yasara available. The next file type that I would like to load is the X3D file type, which is the same as the VRL file type. So if we go to my folder again, I have both of them here, but I'm only going to load one of them. Both of them give the same result. So if you load that object, what you see again is there are a couple of things that are loaded like it was for the Collada file type, so like the direct light, something I'm going to delete immediately. Another thing that you see is that our object is split up into even more smaller parts. So you see that the sheets over there are cut in tiny pieces. This is if you would like to highlight smaller parts of your protein, for example, that's an advantage. However, most of the time it's actually a disadvantage because it's more complicated to group all of the things again. As you see, also the atoms are selectable separately. If I go into the rendered mode, you also see that the color information is not saved. So you have everything at the same color, and you would have to reassign the color information to the protein. Good, so that would be a short overview on the file types that you can find in Chimera. As I said before, the best file type that you can go for would be the Collada file type because it gives you the huge advantage of saving the color information for the atoms. With that, I hope that you are happy with the scene that you generated and that you got a nice overview about the different file types that you can choose from. I'm going to see you in the next tutorial, which is going to be importing objects from Yasara. See you later.